Guruve Gaurachandraya Radhikaya Tarale Krishnaya Krishna Bhaktaya Tadbhaktaya Namo Namaha Vanchakalpatrubhischa Kripa Sindhuve Vacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Sivasadi Shri Gaura Bhaktavinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Dhanavad Pranam devotees. So, as I've been mentioning, I'm sharing a question. I have to pull up the question that came to me via inbox. And I'll read the question here. Oh. Can bhakti be relevant if it doesn't address social issues like race? That's the gist of the question. Can bhakti be relevant if it doesn't address social issues like race? So, the relevancy of bhakti has to be taken in its own space, because relevancy will be subjective, and we cannot measure something absolute by a relative standard. So let me repeat that. So the idea of what is relevant will be according to subjective opinion. This is relevant to me, something is not as relevant to someone else, so forth and so on. But bhakti, being the divine energy of the absolute truth, or God, is something that is an absolute consideration. So the relevancy of something that's absolute can't be brought down to a subjective plane for describing its relevancy. That's the nutshell answer. An expanded answer is that we first have to decide what relevancy is. That's one thing. What is relevancy in an absolute perspective? What is, the concept of the body as a whole when we start considering absolute relevancy? So for instance, is the racial makeup of someone something that we consider when we're discussing the absolute nature of a person? And the answer is clearly no, because the racial identity is a karmic event. In other words, from one life to another, we carry a karmic portfolio that determines our race, our gender, our social dynamic, and so many other things. So we cannot say that the essence of the human experience, the essence of the human being, is based just on the flow of their karma. The essential being is actually the soul, right? So a friend of mine always mentions, a very good friend of mine always mentions, you don't have a soul. You are the soul, and you have a body. So you have a body of a particular race, gender, social circumstance, based in large part on your karmic portfolio. There is no other rationale that explains why the variations of the human experience exist if you take out the factor of karma. There is none. Now, let's get clear on what karma is. Karma is not a predestined shackle. Karma is a pattern. According to what activities you do, there is a concomitant result of those activities, and it sets up like a pattern, right? And it sets up like a template. But the individual desire and the individual expression in any given life is still with that individual. So karma is not a predeterminate. It is actually just a template. And still the individual activities, desires, and aspirations govern what happens to that individual as they move along. So that being clear, what is karma? The racial makeup, the gender makeup, the social dynamics of any individual soul from one life to another is that karmic template. Now, in terms of issues regarding race and social justice, then the factor of karma can't be taken out from that. At the same time, because as we mentioned, karma is not a predeterminate, right? We have to acknowledge that the actions that happen at any given time are live producers of future karma. So, example, if anybody abuses, exploits, just treats in any inhumane way another person, they're generating karma for that. So it's not like karma is an excuse that anything that happens to anyone is okay because it's just their karma. No, nobody's saying that at all. But the karmic factor has allowed a template for something to happen, but still everyone involved in that incident is now generating karma according to their participation and in what way they participated. So if someone is exploitive, abusive, someone is harmful, someone is injurious to another person, right? They receive the karmic results of those activities. And we can't just say that the victim in that incident is just receiving their karma. Certainly there's a karmic implication here, but the person who is the perpetrator of the exploitation or inhumane treatment, they're also getting karma right at that moment. So karma now being somewhat understood, what is the relationship of bhakti to all of these things? Well, bhakti being a divine energy which is meant to stimulate, arouse, and revive the original consciousness of the soul, really has very little to do with the body. So you cannot try to make a subjective relationship between divine absolute energy and the relativity of a karmic experience of different individuals. Just like one time, another question someone asked me, this was some time back, this was before I was doing these sort of sessions in the morning or early afternoon now, right, was about where Krishna consciousness fits in the contemporary social justice movement. So I mentioned to the person that the only thing that can really effect mass change and in a deep and irrevocable way is a change of consciousness. A change of policy has some help. A change of personalities administering policies has some help. But the real efficient and effective change to things which are inhumane in any field is going to be a change of consciousness. And consciousness is an individual experience. So the efficacy of bhakti is that it has the power to change consciousness. That's the efficacy of bhakti. So if people can truly take to the practice of bhakti and follow that process with all it entails, right, then consciousness can change. And when consciousness changes, there's an actual change in the social fabric. Because the social fabric is made up of individuals, right? So it's important to understand that actually bhakti, first of all, is an absolute and divine energy. And the purpose of that divine energy is to affect change in consciousness. But when consciousness is changed in any individual, it has some effect on the overall social fabric, because each individual whose consciousness raises to a certain level and they gain a certain perspective, right, then they start to be able to affect the overall social fabric, right? Because again, the social fabric's made up of individuals, right? And again, when there are cosmetic changes in the social fabric, first of all, they may not be lasting because nothing in the material world has permanency. We don't experience anything in the material world that is permanent. Everything is undergoing some mutation, right? It exists for some time. It begins to mutate. Gradually, it comes to an end at some point, right? Because that's the nature of the material world. Things have a genesis. They exist for some time. They may produce some byproducts. They begin to dwindle, and eventually they disappear, right? So similarly, simply making material changes to things, that process that I just described will happen, right? There'll be a genesis of an idea that we need to make a great change in the social fabric. There'll be a lot of energy behind it. Things will go on for some time, and the sequence I just described will take place. Gradually, it again will wane. This is the nature of anything material. So it's not just social justice issues, but it's the nature of anything material. But when there is a change of consciousness, consciousness is a byproduct of the soul, and the soul is eternal. It is not temporary. Therefore, whatever changes are made in the realization related to the soul are permanent changes. They're not temporary changes. Therefore, when the consciousness is raised, there is an actual change, and the more individuals who undergo actual change of consciousness, that creates the social fabric that we're looking for. In other words, when people come to a level of consciousness where there is mutual respect, where there's a genuine idea of love and affection, where there's a genuine idea of humane treatment, and there's an absolute standard of justice. So that's the next thing to be talked about. What is the absolute standard of justice? If we don't establish what is an absolute standard of justice, and justice becomes relative, right? Then one person's justice may not be another person's justice. You understand? Because who's established what is the absolute justice? You could say, well, as human beings, we have a certain intrinsic value system. But that's not a fact. Because we see that people, according to their karmic portfolio, they may have a certain value system related to that. Just like some people can more easily digest the idea, and I'm just giving this as an example. I don't want a political debate on the issue. I'm not looking for that. I'm just trying to answer a question. And by answering the question, I'm trying to give an example. So in regard to abortion, whatever mentality arises that allows a man and woman, right, to consider that the killing of life in any stage of development is okay, right? And that in fact it can be just, right? Then that's a certain subjective idea of a value system in justice, right? Because their value system informs what they consider to be just. In the same way, someone may look and say, well, wait a minute. From an absolute perspective, a soul has entered the womb in order to fulfill its karmic portfolio. The ultimate aim of human life is to realize God. Now, there I am making a absolute statement, right? And everybody can challenge it as you like. I can't speak from anything but my own informed, consciousness, right? So if we're accepting that the ultimate goal of life is to realize oneself and one's relationship with God, then the person coming in the womb is coming in the womb in order to begin that process of unfoldment from wherever they left off previously. To interrupt that process for subjective reasons, right? Is that actually justice according to an absolute standard of justice, right? So the reason I'm bringing this up because I'm just showing that really, when everybody talks about justice, to some degree they're talking about intrinsic human values, but there is no absolute standard of justice. If so, there would not be a debate about an issue like abortion, right? Because you wouldn't have two opinions on the value of life, right? And the purpose of life. You wouldn't have that debate. There would be a universal acceptance that life is valuable because it is the opportunity to realize our true spiritual nature in a relationship with God. Even more so, since we've gone down this pike, the whole idea of God as a whole now is subjective and relative, right? Now, it certainly may be absolute for those who ascribe to, any spiritual path, not only bhakti, but for a great many people, the idea is that, well, you can believe in God, but, I don't believe in God. So until we establish something is absolute, you can never have an absolute consensus on what is justice or what is proper or what should be done and what should not be done, because there is no absolute standard. There is no absolute criteria. Everything is relative. So my answer would be that yes, first there needs to be established an absolute standard. Of course, any person in any spiritual tradition, what to speak of bhakti, is going to say the absolute standard is the standard that is issued forth from the absolute divinity, or the absolute truth, or the absolute person, of God, right? So that is something that's absolute. Now, unfortunately, we are living in a time where that idea is being relativized more and more because, that's okay if you believe in God, but I don't believe there's a God. Now, of course, you can go through all the arguments of causation and original causation and so forth and so on. And then you'll have people who say, well, it's not that I'm atheist, I'm agnostic, so you get all kinds of nuances, but the end result is that there is a whole posture of relativity. And in relativity, there's never going to be an absolute standard because everyone is different in their karmic unfoldment. And therefore, what is absolutely justice in my eyes may not be the same in someone else's eyes. Just like we may agree, it is inhumane to treat people with exploitation or with physical or mental abuse. That's fine. We can agree to that. We can agree to that. But what's going to stop those things from happening unless there's an absolute standard? Because sometimes the exploitation, the abuse, and the inhumane treatment is the consequence of a person having a particular conception and being in a position of power to execute that conception over someone else's. So in their eyes, it is just. Right? In their eyes, it is just. But if you get an absolute standard from the vision of an absolute relatable truth, right? And that's just the reality of where we are. That's not happening. It's not that everybody believes in God and God is the absolute truth and things that issue forth from that absolute truth or the absolute standard, and we will base our social dealings on that. That's just not the reality. So, that being the case, we have to accept that all things considered in the material arena are going to be predominantly relative. And of course, in our tradition, in the tradition of bhakti, the climate of that relativity is called Kali Yuga. So in this particular age or time, then this idea of the relativity, first of all, regarding absolute truth, becomes more and more prominent. And as a result of that, everything related to the social fabric and the human condition also becomes relative. And because it all becomes relative, one person has one idea of justice, another person has another idea of justice, one person has one idea of what should be done, another person says, no, that should not be done. So this is just the nature of the relative world. The only way to effect change is for any individual to first establish within themselves their own absolute reality. And what I mean by their own absolute reality, I don't mean one that they concoct or one they make up, but the recognition of the existing absolute reality, that I'm the soul, I'm not the body. I have a body. The body is a byproduct of my karmic portfolio. The things that I'm doing right now inform and affect what my future situations will be. And that this whole reality is generated originally from an absolute truth. And whether you want to find that absolute truth by going back to the series of causation, what was the cause of this, what was the cause of that, when you get to an original cause, it will have to be something beyond the material. Because we don't have any finalized material conclusion that we can say is the actual causation of it. Now, some scientists will come forth and say, no, we have established a scientific, air quotes, idea of what the genesis of everything was. Well, I've always been waiting to hear that, what that is, because then my question will be, well, what caused that to happen? So if you don't acknowledge the absolute truth by any nomenclature, Krishna, Allah, Buddha, God, anything, then you have to acknowledge the absolute truth as the origin in terms of the chain of causation, the original cause. Actually, in our tradition, we actually have a name for that. Sarva Karana Karanam. That which is the cause of all other causes. So, anyways, I probably got beyond the subject matter of the question, but, in a nutshell, the relevancy of bhakti to social justice issues, again, going back to kind of summarize, is that bhakti, being an absolute spiritual energy, has the potency to change consciousness. And when consciousness is changed, it has, from the individual level to the nuclear family level, and nuclear family here, I'm not getting into what that's about, to the communal level, to the national level, to the global level, it has the ability to affect the social fabric on all those levels. So when we pick up the practice of bhakti, whether that's in any particular tradition, so right here I'm not specifying the Vaishnava tradition, I'm specifying the idea of a spiritual tradition in which devotion is required, because bhakti originally comes from the Sanskrit word, the root is bhaj, bhajdatu iti sevayam, the idea of serving God. And the service attitude is recognition of my position in relation to God. So when that is imbibed on an individual level, and it's therefore manifest on a familial level, on a family level, and then a communal level, and a national level, and a global level, actual effect will be seen. Until and unless that happens, pretty much the relative I don't want to say reality, but the relative dynamic of individual subjective opinions on everything will exist, and in many cases those opinions will be in conflict with one another, and it will produce social justice issues. And those social justice issues will give rise to relative ideas of how to deal with them, and that will create more relativity, etc., etc. You get the idea. So hopefully not being overly complicated. And again, baseline, bhakti is a spiritual energy, an absolute spiritual energy that has the potency to affect consciousness. Consciousness affected individually translates to how it's affected in a family environment, a communal environment, a national environment, and then finally a global environment. So therefore, bhakti has great relevancy in social issues because it is the foundation under which social issues can actually be transformed into what is desirable in the root of the human experience, which is the soul level of experience. Alrighty, I have to begin some seva. So my Dandavat Pranam to all the devotees and guests who may have come. And hopefully this answers this person's question. This person, I had their permission to ask the question. They're aspiring in devotional life. They have not taken initiation in all of these things yet, but they're aspiring in devotional life. And I thought it was an extremely relevant question. And, probably could be discussed ongoing and probably better in a setting that's more of a panel setting where you have different kinds of input, but I'm just trying to answer a question here. All right, my Dandavat Pranam. Jai Radhe Radhe.